Imagine that your homeland is burning in front of you, and that the only choice is death or departure into the unknown. Have you ever heard of a people who were exterminated just because they wanted to stay in their land? Between 800,000 and 1.5 million Circassians were killed or died on the road, only for the Russians to open a path towards the sea. Known as death marches, can you imagine what the Circassians went through? Stay with us to learn about the history that has been hidden from you for over 160 years. The Circassians, an ancient people, lived in the lush green lands of the northwest Caucasus, a place where towering mountains meet the sea. Their culture was rooted in deep traditions of honor, hospitality, and a profound connection to nature. For centuries, they lived in harmony with their land, proud of their independence and the freedom they held dear. The Circassians were warriors by heart, defenders of their homeland, and protectors of their families. But their way of life was threatened in the early 19th century as the Russian Empire, expanding its power across the region, turned its eyes toward the Caucasus. The land was rich, and its people posed a challenge to Russian expansion. The Circassians, along with other ethnic groups, found themselves in the path of an unstoppable force. They did not bow easily. For decades, they resisted. The Caucasus War, which began in 1817, would stretch on for nearly 50 years, a brutal and exhausting conflict. The Circassians fought with bravery and determination, but the Russian Empire was relentless. Their villages, once peaceful and filled with the sounds of laughter and song, became battlegrounds. Russian troops used brutal tactics to break the spirit of the people. Villages were burned to the ground, crops were destroyed, and families were torn apart. Entire communities disappeared in a trail of smoke and ash. At first, it was an ordinary war, soldiers facing soldiers. But as the conflict dragged on, the tactics of the Russian Empire shifted. The war was no longer just about defeating armies. It became a campaign to erase the Circassians from their own land. The Russian forces began a scorched earth policy, burning not only villages, but the very essence of Circassian life. They targeted civilians, innocent men, women, and children. The violence was slow and merciless. One story, passed down through generations, tells of a mother whose sons went off to fight in the forest. She waited for them to return, but they never did. The news of their death came as a whisper, carried by the wind. The pain she carried in her heart never left, and her sorrow became the sorrow of every mother in the land. By the time the war officially ended in 1864, the Circassians had been pushed to the edge of their existence. The Russian Empire, victorious in its campaign, had left behind a land in ruins. But the war was not truly over for the Circassians. It was just the beginning of a far darker chapter in their history. In 1864, the war ended. The Russian Empire had emerged victorious, but for the Circassians, the real horror was just beginning. The Russian authorities, having crushed the resistance, now turned their attention to the survivors. The land that had once been a vibrant home, filled with laughter and the rhythms of life, was now to be emptied. The Circassians were no longer seen as a people to coexist with. They were viewed as an obstacle to the empire's ambitions. The Russian Empire sought not only to conquer them militarily, but to erase them from history altogether. The first step in this dark plan was mass deportation. The Circassians, once proud and free, were to be forced from their homes and marched to the Black Sea. But this was no simple relocation. The Russians did not offer them a chance to leave peacefully. Instead, the Circassians were thrust into what would be known as the death marches. Thousands upon thousands of men, women, and children were forced to walk through the mountains and valleys of their homeland with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They had no food, no water, and no shelter. The cold was biting, and the land that had once been home became a path to their destruction. People dropped from exhaustion, their bodies too weak to continue. The elderly, the sick, the young, all were caught in the march, their steps slow and painful, their spirits crushed by the knowledge of what awaited them. Children died in their mother's arms, their small bodies too fragile to withstand the harsh conditions. Families collapsed along the way, their members succumbing to hunger, disease, and the bitter cold. The trees, once symbols of strength and endurance, now stood as silent witnesses to the suffering of the people. Whole villages vanished, their people lost along the roads, swallowed up by the unforgiving wilderness. The journey to the Black Sea was only the beginning. Once they reached the coast, the survivors found no relief. Ships waited to carry them to the Ottoman Empire, to Syria, Turkey, and beyond. But they were not ships of mercy. The vessels were overcrowded with refugees packed so tightly that there was no room to breathe, no space to move. Disease spread like wildfire, and those who were already weak from the long march succumbed in the stifling heat. Some died before the ships could even set sail. Others were thrown overboard, their lives extinguished in the vast sea. Western observers, who had witnessed the chaos and suffering, wrote of the tragedy with sorrow. One letter from a foreign witness described the scene at the Black Sea port. I saw mothers with empty eyes, holding nothing but the memory of their lost children. I saw men who had once stood proud, now broken, with nothing left but the weight of what had been stolen from them. The true scale of the tragedy was too immense for words to capture. One survivor, whose story was passed down through generations, wrote in a diary, "We left with 1,000. I arrived with only my shadow." It was a simple, heart-wrenching statement, but it captured the full extent of the loss. The journey had taken their homes, their families, and their future. In its place, only the haunting silence of survival remained. The survivors who made it to the Ottoman Empire were not free. They were broken people, stripped of everything they had once known. The trauma of the forced exile would remain with them, seeping into the very marrow of their bones. But even in the face of such overwhelming grief, they carried with them the memory of their homeland. It was all they had left. The Circassians who survived the long and harrowing journey across the sea found themselves scattered across the vast lands of the Ottoman Empire. Syria, Turkey, Jordan, Palestine, and even further. But their survival was not the same as freedom. They arrived in strange lands, surrounded by foreign customs, unfamiliar languages, and new rulers. They were a displaced people, haunted by memories of their lost homeland, a homeland they could never return to. Though they were alive, they were far from safe. The Circassians faced poverty and hardship in their new homes. They were often regarded as outsiders, treated with suspicion and sometimes even hostility. The trauma of their displacement, the violence they had endured, and the loss of their land and culture created wounds that would not heal with time. The Circassian people were forced to rebuild their lives from the ground up, but the foundation was cracked, and the pain of what they had lost echoed through every day. But there was one thing the Circassians could not lose: their memory. The story of their homeland, their struggle, and their suffering was passed down through generations. They kept their history alive through oral traditions, songs, and lullabies sung to their children in the quiet of the night. These were not just stories. They were the lifeblood of their identity. They were the means by which the Circassian people could survive, even without their land. The wounds of exile ran deep, and the trauma was carried in the bones of every Circassian who had been forced to leave their homeland. The loss was not just a matter of land, it was the loss of an entire way of life. Yet even in their grief, the Circassians did not disappear. They built new communities, forming a diaspora that stretched across the globe. But the pain of the past was never far behind them. They lived with the knowledge that their homeland had been taken from them, and that the memory of their suffering had been forgotten by much of the world. And so, the fight for recognition began. Circassians today continue to demand recognition of the genocide that took their people to the brink of extinction. They speak not only for themselves, but for those who did not survive, for the thousands of voices that were silenced in the death marches and on the overcrowded ships. The Circassians' plea is simple. Remember us. Recognize our pain. Understand that our history is not just a chapter of the past, but a part of our present identity. Their story is one of immense loss, but also of survival. For the Circassians, remembrance is resistance. It is a way of holding on to the pieces of their culture, their language, and their way of life. It is a way of telling the world that even though their land was taken, they have not been forgotten. And even if the homeland they loved can never be reclaimed, their identity, rooted in grief and survival, will endure. The Circassian people may have been displaced, but they will never be erased. Their memories, their stories, and their identity will live on as a testament to their strength, their resilience, and the unbreakable bond they share with the land they once called home. The Circassian tragedy was not just about displacement. It was the uprooting of a people from their land and from memory. A nation exiled, whose cries still echo, waiting to be acknowledged. But were the Circassians the only ones to suffer such a fate? Were they alone in paying the price for the world's silence? In the next video, we tell the story of another people who endured a similar catastrophe in the early 20th century, the Armenian Genocide. Watch to understand how pain repeats itself, under different names, but through the same silence.